Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest Thriving Talent LinkedIn Live. My name is Natalie Wilkin. My pronouns are she, her, and it's a real pleasure to see many of you again. For those of you who are joining us live, hello, it's nice to see you or meet you. And for those who might be watching the recording later, thank you for making the time to learn about this really important topic, which we're going to be spending time on today. So what we've planned for you today is to walk you through the topic of inclusive recruitment, specifically looking at why this is important for your organizations and your teams, and how you can make these processes more equitable and inclusive for a large range of people. And if you have any questions or comments, if you have something to add or share, feel free to add to the chat and to raise your questions. I'll be making time for that. But it's going to be a fast-paced 30 minutes together. So please hold on as we get into this topic. Now, the first point I wanted to spend some time on is to answer the question, why is this important? Why even bother thinking about the way that we recruit and why it's important to focus our recruitment efforts and make them more inclusive and equitable. So I'm going to add to the stage some visuals to bring this to life. One of the first arguments or positions on this is that there's going to be a lot more competition in the marketplace in the next few years, as we have a big group, a big generation exiting organizations and retiring between now and the next 5 years. In Switzerland alone, which is where we are headquartered, Advance and University of St. Gallen had reported a couple of years ago that there's going to be a really big skill gap in Switzerland. And we've really got an opportunity here to get more people back into work, especially women who took a step out or carers who took a step out of their career. And so there's going to be up to 800,000 employees missing by 2030. Now, if you're living in another country, a bigger country compared to Switzerland, the number is going to be much bigger inside of your country, and the impact is going to be very similar in terms of different sectors and in different industries, that there's going to be this skill and experience gap. Another reason why we know that this is a fact, that this is happening in many countries, is we had seen a report that came out in January 2025 by the World Economic Forum. It's called the Future of Jobs Report. If you haven't seen this before, I highly recommend you go out and seek it out on the WEF, on the forum's website. And they are reporting that the skill shortage is happening at a global level. This generation that's moving out of business is a pretty big one, and a lot of experience is leaving with them. And when we start looking at specific industries, such as, for example, the mining industry is just one industry out of many, there's a real crisis, because a lot of the young people coming through the education systems, who are the future pipeline for these different industries, these different skills, are often not even considering certain sectors as being interesting for them to be trained and to be employed by. So if you are in one of these industries where your reputation perhaps, or the interest level from young people is diminishing, you're going to have an extra challenge on your hands, because you won't be able to attract the numbers which are available in the marketplace to come into your workplaces. So this is one of the key reasons why we talk about this with companies, because you will be facing this challenge in the very near future, if not already. And so by thinking about how to make your recruitment process more inclusive, essentially what you're doing is you're considering, how can we widen up our different roles and opportunities to a broader range of people? How can we make these roles more attractive to more people? And I'm not talking about reducing your requirements in terms of qualifications or skills necessarily, but it's about how can we break some of the stereotypes around these roles and the types of groups that these roles normally speak to, and how can we open these up to qualified, experienced, but diverse groups of applicants. So I'm hoping I'm going to give you some language here on how you can talk about this inside your companies, because it's really important to help business leaders, especially the executive team to understand why this is a game changer for the business. Now, when we start thinking about the typical recruitment process, and I'm going to try and make this a little bit bigger so that you can see the screen more clearly. Hopefully you can. What we're talking about is various stages where you have opportunities to increase equity and make the process more inclusive. The typical recruitment process in most companies, especially the clients that we work with, will always begin by drafting a job description. These job descriptions define the needs of the role, the type of person, the type of applicant that you're looking for, and they often get translated into job adverts, which are then posted on your career pages and different job boards, such as LinkedIn, or shared with recruiters outside of the company. And that's when you start to source your applicants. You're sourcing internally, but also through external channels. And then once you have a number of CVs, as you know, you get to that long listing, shortlisting stage where you start to look at what is out there in terms of the applicants and who fits the role that you're hiring for. And what you can see here on screen is that a typical recruitment process has these stages, but there are some best practices that you can introduce to make the process more equitable and inclusive. So from the beginning, you can look at tools or ways to make the language of those job descriptions and job adverts more inclusive. When you're sourcing, not only do you want to look internally, but what other channels and diverse channels can you reach out to find the talent out there that you might be missing? And at the shortlisting stage, for example, you could be introducing some practices such as semi-blind or anonymous CVs into the process so that we're mitigating some biases that happen when we look at these CVs. And then you get to interviews, and you could be introducing something like a structured interview process. Or you could be also introducing, as part of this, some work sample assessments or some case studies, so that you're really starting to building different selection methods in order to get a fuller picture about the individuals that you're considering for the role. And then once you've identified the right person or group of people for these roles, you probably typically do background checks. That they are flawed, and there's definitely biases in there. But if you do them, you need to do them for everyone so that it's truly fair. And then ideally, as you get to the offer stage, you have standardized offers. You're able to take into account maybe some specific needs from different individuals to make it worthwhile and attractive for them to accept the offer. And then we continue. So this is what a typical recruitment process will look like. Now, when we talk about biases in recruitment, there are many biases that you will come up against, and you probably are aware of them already. There's some very typical ones out there. Stereotype bias is one where we associate certain characteristics or certain professions linked to gender, linked to different types of stereotypes. Affinity bias is another one. We tend to be attracted to the types of people who are similar to us, that we feel comfortable with. When you start to think about specific stages of the recruitment process, let's take sourcing and shortlisting as an example. You will be impacted by bias such as beauty bias or performance bias. You associate people's place of study or where they've worked in more favorable or less favorable perceptions around that information. Or beauty bias, for example, in Switzerland, we still have this tradition of putting our photographs on the CVs, and that influences people. They get a first impression about who you are and what you're like, and a lot of the time these first impressions or these beauty biases are very misleading, and it may create some unconscious bias and resistance around reading the rest of your CV or even considering you for the role. So it's very important to be clear with your hiring managers, with your HR team, that these biases exist and they do affect recruitment at different stages. So just to bring this to life a little bit more for you, if we look back on screen now, you can see there's many different types of biases that show up at different stages. So how can you mitigate these biases, and how can you focus on how you make each stage equitable and inclusive? So that's what I'm about to do. I'm going to walk you through some specific strategies and tools that you could be leveraging. And like I said, if you have any questions or anything to add to this conversation, then do feel free to add to the chat. So let's start with job descriptions and adverts. I think this is one of the easiest areas to start, because this often is the stage that sets the tone and leads the way for the rest of the process. If you can get it right here, you will mitigate biases in many other steps as well. So as we know from this particular source and many others, people get discouraged from applying when they don't resonate with the language and the content of the job that's being advertised. Develop Diverse is one service provider who offers software around improving the language of job adverts. There's also other great tools out there. WittyWorks is a local provider, Swiss-based provider. Their tool also provides this type of assistance, not only in English, but in French and in German. So there are many tools out there that have now been developed to screen job descriptions and adverts for the stereotypes and the language and the level of inclusion in the language of these adverts. And it doesn't take a lot to turn candidates off from applying. For example, you see on the right here, 0.6% of words can discourage applicants. So it only takes 5 words on average in a job advert to turn someone off. So by really focusing on how you present this job and the range of people that it speaks to feel excited and attracted to apply for this job is really, really important. And so here are some tips on how you can screen these job adverts if you don't have the luxury of a tool like Develop Diverse or WittyWorks. First and foremost, and I think HR people will know this question well, is you need to really challenge yourself and ask, is this job advertisement realistic? Is that person really out there? I've seen so many job adverts with dozens of bullet points describing the perfect applicant for the role. And, we've got a skill shortage and a skill gap coming up in the next few years, folks. So you've got to really challenge yourself about how realistic you're being and where you're setting the bar. And start to minimize and really hone in on what's really essential between the role that needs to be performed, so that you can ask and be more flexible with some of the requirements, the person requirements that you need to attract into this. And then the next 2 questions are super important, especially if you want to make things more equitable and inclusive, is when you read that job advert, you've got to challenge yourself and imagine, who does this speak to? What kind of person or what kind of profile does this speak to? And who does it exclude? And that second question is really, really important, because if you start to then apply some empathy and put yourself in the shoes of different groups of people, you might start to realize that the language, the tone, and the requirements are actually going to put off specific groups of people that might be qualified and very relevant for the role that you're trying to hire for. And the best way to ask these questions is not to sit by yourself with your own identity of who you are answering these questions. It's to share it with different types of people with different backgrounds and experiences and representation. Representation is the key word here. Who are you involving in reviewing your job adverts? Do they all look the same? Do they all have the same background? Because if you ask those people, you're not probably going to get anything constructive in terms of feedback. But if you ask different people who have different representation in terms of gender, age, background, career, education, race, ethnicity, nationality, you will get a lot more rich feedback on how well that job advert is designed and who it might be excluding inadvertently. So that's my top tip for job adverts, is use a tool or ask some pertinent questions to challenge the content and the language that's being used. So by making that step, you're recognizing that there are biases, but you're not trying to, figure out exactly which ones they are. You're starting to think about and empathize with different groups of people and making that advert more appealing to a broader audience. So assuming you've done that and you've got more interesting, diverse groups of people applying to your job, then we need to talk about candidate selection. I am skipping past sourcing because sourcing candidates has its own challenges depending on the profession that you're hiring for and how many graduates are coming out with different mix of representation. One of the big topics, especially in the STEM sector, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics sector, is that there isn't a disproportionate number of female graduates compared to men because of other factors that influence boys and girls picking the subject that they want to study and work in. And so there's always going to be some inherent challenges with that. And you need to get very creative about finding those graduates or finding those professionals from those underrepresented groups by talking to them, finding out where they hang out, what media they consume, which groups or associations they're a member of, and get more creative about who you network and connect with to reach out to a more diverse group of applicants fitting your role. But because it's so specific to different sectors, we won't have time for that today. But hopefully I've got you thinking about, who else can I network with or tap into to attract more diverse people into these specific roles. But let's get into candidate selection, because this is another important step to the process, and it takes and requires so much of your time. It's a big investment from your side to get this right. So how do we get it right? Well, the first question I want to ask you is, when you're thinking about the right applicant or the right person to do the role that you're hiring for, what are the ways in which you predict their future job performance? What are the ways you think might be helpful, or the methods, selection methods that might be helpful for you to predict future job performance? What do you think? I ask this question in our inclusive recruitment trainings to hiring managers and HR people alike. And I'm always surprised with the answers I get, because we tend to fall back sometimes on traditional ways of making choices or evaluations about people. And some of the ways that people think are the right way are inherently biased. And when you start to look at the studies around predictive validity of different selection methods, they actually are one of the weakest ways to work out whether someone's going to perform on the job in the future or not. So what are some of those ways? So if you think about a traditional hiring process, you tend to attract by using your network. We all typically network and are a fit and have an affinity bias with people who are like us. So if you're really relying on employee recommendations, for example, for different roles, don't be surprised whilst they're tapping into their network that the applicants they present are probably going to look and seem very similar to them. So you've got to break that. People apply using their CV and a cover letter. We are in the era of artificial intelligence. Who do you think is helping people write their CVs and cover letters? And we can use these tools to influence the decision makers looking at our cover letters and CVs to shortlist us for the role. So you can't really depend on CVs and cover letters. It's a big no-no. And then you're literally, especially if you're a recruiter or hiring manager, you have 30, 50, maybe 100 to look at. How many seconds are you actually spending on each CV? Are you rushing this stage? Are you making very instinctual, emotional decisions about people? Case. And then in the interview stage, if you don't have a structured process, it's going to be emotional for sure. It's going to be a gut-driven process. And again, that doesn't predict future outcomes of your hire. So when we look at some of the studies that have taken place over the last couple of decades on which assessments or selection methods predict future job performance, you can see that CVs in general score very low. But when you start to layer in other approaches, such as cognitive ability tests, structured interviews, such as the competency-based interview, work sample tests, and especially work sample tests and technical assessments, which have been validated across a diverse group of people and are respectful of people's time to complete them, those methods have a higher range of predictive validity compared to the CV. Okay, so you can actually base this final decision on the CV. It's just an entry point. It gives you an indication that the person might meet the criteria that you're looking for, but you really need to invest in these other methods. And even if you invest in these other methods and a combination of them, which is better, you're only going to get to maybe 0.6, 0.65 of this predictive validity score. It goes up to 1. So there's always going to be a gap on whether you can really reliably predict someone's future job performance. So there's always going to be a risk that you're taking when hiring someone, but the key messages here is invest in the selection methods that reduce that risk as much as possible. So that in best practice, as I mentioned already, not only are you using diverse channels to attract diverse applicants, your adverts are inclusive so that they actually apply, but start to think about applying some other practices, such as the semi-anonymous or anonymous reviews of CVs, and having more structure and other data points, example, work samples, technical assessments, etc. And you need to be interviewing people and running these processes with more than one person. If you expect one person to have the ability to assess and evaluate someone in a short space of time without being biased, then I'm sorry to say you're going to fail miserably. It's not going to work. And a lot of the time, those decisions are going to be emotional and gut driven. So you really need to also think about how you can team people up, especially during the interview processes, so that they can rely on each other to be more objective and less biased. So when we look at shortlisting, we know that different factors can bias our assumptions about the person and whether they should be shortlisted for the position that they're applying for. There are multiple studies out there, again, over the last 20 to 30 years, that consistently show that different factors influence our decisions in terms of the type of representation that is more likely to get a callback or an invitation for an interview compared to others. Names, especially names that are not fitting the dominant name structure in a country, is one big factor, but also gender. We know that that can also play a role, especially when you start to think about gender stereotyped careers. Women are less likely to get a callback compared to men in engineering versus male applicants are less likely to get a callback when they apply for secretary administrative roles compared to women. So you've got to realize that this is a factor that happens, and often it's unconscious. We don't intend this to happen, and it does. So when then you look at someone's CV, all of these different informations on the CV have the possibility of triggering any one of these biases. Again, we don't really know it's happening, but it's happening. So what are the steps that you can take to improve this? Well, first, you need to find the applicants, and hopefully if you've written your job advert in an inclusive way, then you're finding more diverse applicants to consider. But the first step is to really establish clear criteria that you're going to apply to every CV you review that are required for the role. And that's why I said getting the job advert and the job description right in the first place and being super clear about what's essential and what's fair for the role that you're hiring for will serve you well in the steps that follow. So establishing clear criteria, having a scorecard with that criteria, if you like, a rubric that you compare all the CVs against and you score with a similar assessment approach, will give you a very objective view of who's the most qualified or the top ranking candidates to be invited to the next step. And it's really important that you assess everyone against that same criteria. So what does that kind of scorecard look like? Some of you might have seen this before. It typically looks like this. You've got the essential criteria that was in your job adverts, you've got the candidates listed, and you've got a scoring rubric. This is a simple one. 3 exceeds expectations, 2 meets, and 1 is slightly below. And you give everyone a score against those different criteria. And if you do it in Excel, voila, you have a quick formula to tell you what their score is. If you want to get sophisticated, you can even weight some of these criteria. But all that to say, you're being consistent. And then we get to structured panel interviews. Okay, this is another best practice where you have more than one interviewer. So they're interviewing together, each applicant, and they're doing it in a structured way. What does that mean? Well, I like to make the joke that interviews are often a little bit like speed dating. You don't really spend a lot of time with a person. And you're potentially hiring them for many years to come. So how can you really maximize that time that you have with them? Well, first is don't shortchange the interview. Please make it at least 1 hour long, and then hopefully there's a second round after that. The more criteria that's important to this role, essential to this role, the more time you need to spend with that person to get to know them and assess them against that criteria. You've also got to remember that this is a two-way process. They are interviewing you as a potential employer just as much. So you also need to build in that time to answer their questions, to give them some insights about the type of team they'll be joining and what that role will entail. So again, just as the shortlisting best practice is if you can get very clear on what's job critical in terms of skills and behaviors, sometimes we call these competencies, and at what level will they be expected to perform for the role, you get a very clear rubric of how you're going to assess and evaluate the candidate after each interview. And it's important that when you are interviewing with other people, that you align on these factors in advance. They have to be clear about the criteria, what is a meets expectations, what might classify as an above expectations, so that everyone is assessing in a similar way. Because then when you get to the hiring decision, there isn't really an argument or incongruence in terms of different people's evaluations about the candidates. So it's really important to invest that time in clarifying and aligning before you interview. And having a rubric, whether it's a 3-point scale, a 5-point scale, will save you a lot of time and make this easier. So similar to the scorecard for shortlisting, you can have something similar for interviewing. And this type of scorecard is really helpful when you have that final debrief where you share your evaluations for every candidate at the same time. And top tip is start with the person who is furthest away from the decision, i.e., don't ask the hiring manager first, ask the person who supported them, and let the hiring manager go last. Because again, especially in cultures where there's hierarchy involved, the people outside of the leadership role will sometimes not stand by their evaluations if the person in power and authority has a different view and perspective about the candidate. So it's always good to do it the other way around so that you avoid these biases. And these are the biases that I see most typical at this stage of the process. Only when you've defined your criteria and how you're going to evaluate this criteria, could you then come up with the right questions that you need to ask to gather the information during the interview. It doesn't work well the other way around. You have to start with the criteria, and then you can define the right questions to ask. This is an example of what a pre-prepared interview structure can look like. And this, for example, is only for one skill or competency area. So if you're assessing multiple areas in an interview, then you would have variations of this page for those particular skills. So now we finally come to hiring decisions. Okay, this is again one of the last stages that can make or break who you hire. And this is where we often slip up and are influenced by our biases. Now, if you've done everything I've mentioned in advance of this, then you're going to be in a really good place already. because you've been objective and you've been fair with the candidates. But then when you get in that group, and I mentioned it already, you have influence over each other. You have to, in advance of the interviews, remind one another that when you get to this point, you are allowed to constructively challenge each other if you hear or sense bias in the way that the candidates have been evaluated. So ideally, each person in the interview team gets to assess and evaluate the candidate in silence without influencing the other, so that when you get together for the debrief, you really have had the chance to evaluate fairly and consistently. And then you take it in turns to speak. Ideally, hiring manager goes last, and you're using a scorecard like I showed you to track the criteria and the scores along the way, so that it really paints the picture of who's the best fit for the role, who's the right hire. I mentioned the word fit. You have to be very, very careful here, because one of the most typical traps I see teams fall into is, oh, this person won't fit with the team. But if you have so many people alike in that team already, that's a clear way to stay homogeneous and not bring in diversity to your team. You have to look for culture add. And what I mean by that is think about the culture of your team and the values that are important to your team or organization, and challenge yourselves to think about, how can this person bring in and add to our culture? That's a much better measure of fit than they look, they sound, they're similar to us, right? Especially when we talk about personality preferences. Don't even go there, because that can be really dangerous in terms of reinforcing certain stereotypes. And it's important to document the feedback and then scan for further biases when you're reviewing the interviewer notes. So I've covered a lot in a very short space of time. Normally, this is covered in a training with interactive exercises that take up at least half a day. And I hope that was helpful and gave you some insights and tips. Thank you, Yobda, for your feedback. I'm glad to hear that it was insightful for you. I can see there was one question that came up around halfway through from Yelena. How to understand where is the border between biases and realistic job requirement to avoid getting lost in details or go to another extreme hunting for biases. I think I'm hoping the questions around who is included and who is excluded might give you some sense of how that works. Yelena, I encourage you to just take a job advert, sit down with some diverse colleagues, maybe over a coffee, and challenge yourselves to put yourself in different groups and different representation shoes to see where that job advert might be written in a more exclusive way. Sometimes it's not, sometimes it is. But I think if you do that exercise, you'll be surprised to hear what maybe some other ways you can improve the job advert. Thank you for listening, especially if you've taken the time to watch the recording after this live event. And if you have any questions about what we do, how we can support you through this with consulting, training, e-learning, then please do reach out and we'd be happy to help. Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of the week.